This is my chance. I will find him.
Where are we going?
To a place with brighter mornings.
I'm not going. I'm not going.
She told herself it was just until spring. That was the agreement. That was the whole of it, written down in plain language on a plain piece of paper, signed by both of them at the kitchen table of a ranch she had never seen before, and would, she fully intended, never see again after the snow melted and the roads opened, and she could get herself and her daughter back to something that resembled a plan. Just until spring. She had said it to herself on the ride out from town, sitting in the wagon with the cold coming through her coat, and her daughter pressed against her side, sleeping the way only small children sleep, completely and without reservation, trusting entirely that whoever was holding them would keep them safe. She had said it while looking at the mountains going gray and white in the November dusk. She had said it like a promise and a warning and a kind of prayer all at once. It was not supposed to become anything. She was not in a position for it to become anything. Her name was Ruth Hadley, and she was 30 years old, and she had been making temporary arrangements for the better part of 2 years, ever since the world she had built carefully and hopefully had come apart in the space of a single afternoon when a man she had trusted completely had demonstrated, with devastating efficiency, that she had been the only one doing the trusting. Her husband Daniel had left, not in the dramatic way, not with a scene or an argument or even a proper goodbye. He had simply not come back one evening, and the next morning there was a letter, brief and without adequate explanation, and the morning after that there was a creditor at the door, and the morning after that another one, and by the end of the week, Ruth understood that the life she had believed she was living had been built on a foundation that only one of them had known was hollow. She had sold what she could. She had moved herself and her daughter Bess into a single room above a laundry in a town she had not grown up in and did not particularly want to stay in. She had taken work where she could find it. She had gotten very efficient at making small amounts of money stretch in directions money does not naturally want to go. Bess was 4 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she did not fully understand what had happened except that they moved a lot, and some mornings Mama was very quiet, and on those mornings it was better to play near her than to go far. The advertisement Ruth had answered was not for a wife. That was the thing that had made her read it twice. It was for a housekeeper, a temporary one specifically. A rancher in the mountains of Wyoming needed someone to manage the house and care for his son through the winter months, while the regular housekeeper recovered from a broken leg in town. The advertisement was specific about the temporary nature of the position. It offered a wage, modest but real, and room and board for the duration. It said, and she had read this part 3 times, that a child was not an obstacle if the woman was otherwise suitable. She had written that same day. He had replied within the week. His name was Archer Cole. His letter was brief and functional, and told her what he needed and when he needed it, and where to come, and how much the wage would be, and that the position ended when the roads opened in spring, no later. No later. He had underlined it. She had taken this as a sign of a man who was clear about what he wanted, which she appreciated, having recently lived with the consequences of a man who had been deeply unclear. She had written back to say she was coming, and packed her trunk and told herself, for the first time, but not the last time, just until spring. Before this story goes any further, I want you to stay right here with Ruth, and with what happens on that ranch when the snow comes down and the world gets small, and 2 people who both decided not to need anything find themselves needing each other in ways neither one planned for. And if this is your first time finding this channel, please subscribe right now. There are so many more stories here, and every single one of them was written for you. The ranch was further from town than she had expected, and larger than the advertisement had suggested, and considerably more in need of a woman's attention than a man who had written a functional letter would ever have thought to mention. She understood all of this within the first 20 minutes of arriving. Archer Cole met the wagon in the yard. He was tall in the way of men who have done physical work their whole lives, not bulky but structured, like something built for endurance rather than display. He had dark hair going gray at the edges, and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor recently, and eyes the color of deep river water, green-brown and difficult to read at a glance. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Bess, who was awake now and regarding him with the frank, unblinking assessment that 4-year-olds apply to new people. He looked at the trunk. "You made it," he said. It was not quite a welcome and not quite a statement. It was the words of a man who had not been entirely certain she would come and was now recalibrating. "I said I would," Ruth said. He nodded. He took the trunk. Inside the house, the state of things became apparent. It was not dirty exactly. It was the particular disorder of a man managing alone who had been managing alone long enough that he had stopped seeing what was not getting done. Dishes were clean but stacked without system. The fire was good, but the wood was not restocked. The floor had been swept, but not recently. The kitchen had the look of a place where food was produced out of necessity rather than any particular attention to the process. Ruth looked at all of this with the calm assessment of a woman who had been making the best of difficult situations for 2 years. "Where is your son?" she asked. "Thomas," Archer said. "He is in the barn. He likes the barn." "How old?" 6. She nodded. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and began, without ceremony, to understand the kitchen. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment, and something moved across his face that she did not fully catch. Then he went back outside. Thomas appeared at supper time, a small, serious boy with his father's coloring and a scratch on his chin and dirt on both knees that suggested the barn had been enthusiastically engaged with. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Ruth with those river-colored eyes, and then looked at Bess, who was sitting at the table drawing shapes on a piece of paper Ruth had found for her. Bess looked up. She considered Thomas for a moment with the thoroughness of a child conducting an evaluation. "I am Bess," she said. "I am 4. Thomas said, "I am 6. Then after a pause, "What are you drawing?" "A horse," Bess said. "It is not very good." "I can draw horses," Thomas said. He came inside and sat down across from her and picked up the spare piece of paper Ruth set in front of him without being asked, and the two of them were engaged in the business of horse drawing for the rest of the evening. Ruth cooked supper and watched them from the corner of her eye and felt something quiet and complicated move through her. She recognized it. It was the feeling of her daughter being at ease. It had been a while since she had seen it so quickly. Archer came in from the evening chores and washed up and sat at the table, and the 4 of them ate together, which Ruth had not entirely anticipated. She had imagined something more formal, separate perhaps, employer and employee maintaining proper distance. But the table was one table, and the kitchen was one kitchen, and it would have taken more effort to eat separately than together, and Archer Cole was not, she was already understanding, a man who spent energy on things that required more effort than they were worth. He said very little at supper. He ate steadily and without complaint, and he listened to Thomas tell him something about a horse in the barn that had a particular habit, listened with the complete attention of a father who finds everything his child says genuinely interesting. Ruth watched this from her end of the table and thought about Daniel, who had rarely looked up from his plate. She stopped thinking about Daniel. She was done using him as the measure of other men. It was an unfair comparison in both directions. After supper, Archer said, "The position is as I described it in the letter. The house, the meals, Thomas during the days when I am working the property. If there is anything you need for the house, you can make a list and I will get it from town on my next supply run." "All right," she said. "If something is not working, say so. I would rather know." "Same," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those unreadable eyes. Then he nodded and said good night, and that was the first evening. The days that followed had their own rhythm, and she found it quickly, the way competent people find rhythms, by paying attention to what was already there and working with it rather than against it. She learned the kitchen and the storeroom and the way the fire needed to be managed in the mornings. She learned that Thomas was a child of few words but consistent habits, and that consistency was what made him feel safe, so she was consistent. She learned that Archer left before dawn and came in after dark during the first weeks, when there was still autumn work to finish before the winter shut everything down, and that he was tired in the evenings in the way of a man who gives everything he has to the daylight hours and has nothing theatrical left over. She did not mind any of this. She had not come for entertainment. Bess and Thomas reached an arrangement of their own, the kind that children reach without adult assistance, based on some interior negotiation that Ruth was never entirely privy to. They played together with the earnest focus of children who have both been somewhat lonely and have recognized that fact in each other. Thomas showed Bess the barn and the horses and his particular spot by the creek where the ice was forming in patterns he found interesting. Bess showed Thomas her way of making up stories, elaborate and unpredictable, which he listened to with great seriousness as though they were factual accounts. Ruth watched her daughter's face in the evenings and saw the ease in it and felt the complicated thing again, stronger this time. She reminded herself. Just until spring. The first real snow came in late November, and it came seriously, the way Wyoming snow comes when it means to, deep and fast and with a wind that made the house creak and the windows go opaque with frost. Ruth woke in the night to hear it and lay in the dark listening and felt the particular isolation of being somewhere far from everything she knew, which should have been frightening and was instead, inexplicably, a kind of relief. Nobody could reach her here. No creditor, no reminder, no evidence of the life that had fallen apart. Just snow and wind and a house that was holding. In the morning, Archer was already up when she came to the kitchen. He was at the stove with his back to her and he had made coffee, which surprised her. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and turned and held out a cup without saying anything, and she took it and they stood at the window together and looked at the white world outside, and neither of them spoke for a while. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who are both, in their different ways, at home in quiet. "The east fence will need checking," he said eventually, "after it eases." "I will keep the children in today," she said. He nodded. They drank their coffee. The snow went on coming. It was Thomas who first began to undo her careful management of the situation, though he did it without any intention. It happened about 3 weeks into her time at the ranch. She had been putting him to bed and reading to him, which had become part of the evening routine, and he had listened to the story with his usual seriousness, and then lay looking at the ceiling for a while the way he did sometimes before sleep. Then he said, "My mother used to read to me." Ruth went still. "She did," she said quietly. "She died," he said. Not dramatically, just as a fact he had learned to carry. "When I was 3. I do not remember her very well, but Papa has a picture." Ruth sat with that for a moment. "Do you miss her?" Thomas thought about this seriously. "I miss having one," he said. "Papa does not say so, but I think he does too." He looked at her sideways with those river-colored eyes. "Bess is lucky. She has you." Ruth said carefully, "You have your papa. He loves you very much. I can see it every time he looks at you." "I know," Thomas said. "I just meant—" He stopped. Seemed to decide not to finish the sentence. "Good night, Miss Ruth." "Good night, Thomas." She went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while with her hands around a cooling cup of tea and looked at the fire and thought about a small boy who missed having a mother and a man with river-colored eyes who did not say what he missed. She thought about just until spring. She thought about how spring had seemed like an adequate container for this situation when she had made the arrangement, and how it was beginning to feel, in ways she could not entirely defend, like not very long at all. The crisis arrived, as crises do on ranches in Wyoming winters, without announcement and at the worst possible time. It was a Sunday in January, the deep middle of the winter when the cold had settled in with the permanence of something that intended to stay. Archer had gone out to check on the herd in the north pasture, a ride of several hours in conditions that were manageable when he left, and had shifted by mid-afternoon into something considerably less so. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind had come up, and by 4 o'clock Ruth was standing at the window watching the light go and feeling the particular cold weight of worry that has no outlet because there is nothing to do with it. Thomas stood beside her. He did not say anything. He had learned to read weather and what it meant for his father the way ranch children learn such things, early and without being taught directly. Bess was at the table behind them, quieter than usual, understanding in the way children understand that the air in the room had changed. At 5 o'clock, Ruth made supper and set it to stay warm, and put the children to bed earlier than usual, which they accepted without argument, and then she went and stood by the window again. He came in at 6:30. She heard the horse before she saw the light of the lantern, and she had his coffee poured and the fire stoked before he got through the door. He came in with the cold coming off him in waves, and his face reddened from the wind, and one hand held at an angle that immediately told her something was wrong with it. "Sit down," she said. "I am all right," he said. "You are holding your hand like it is broken. Sit down." He sat. She brought the lamp closer and looked at his hand, which was not broken but was badly bruised across the knuckles from a fall he described briefly and without embellishment. She got the basin and the cloth, and he sat at the kitchen table and let her tend to it without speaking, which cost him something, she could see that. He was not a man who accepted help easily. She worked carefully, and he was still under her hands. "The herd is in," he said. "Lost one to the creek, but the rest came through." "Good," she said. She did not look up. "You were watching for me," he said. It was not quite a question. She paused. Then she said, "The children were worried." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the top of her head. "Ruth," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Direct and unguarded, the careful management of his face simply gone. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been trying not to look at directly, and has finally run out of the particular energy that looking away requires. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But the way he said it carried more than the two words held. She looked back at him for a moment. Then she looked back at his hand. "There is a bruise here that will be sore for a week," she said. "Do not use it hard tomorrow." "All right," he said. She wrapped it. He did not move his hand away after she finished. She became aware that she had not moved her hands away either. They sat like that for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she stood up and took the basin to the sink, and he sat at the table, and they had supper and talked about the herd and the weather, and neither of them mentioned it. But it had happened, and they both knew it had. February was the month everything shifted, and neither of them tried to stop it. They did not speak about it directly. It was not that kind of shift. It was quieter than that. It was the accumulation of 100 small daily things that had been building since November and had reached, somewhere in the deep cold of February, a weight that changed their shape. He began to come in earlier in the evenings. Not obviously, just by degrees. Half an hour, then an hour, and then he was at the table for supper with the children with the consistency of a man who has decided, without announcing it, that supper with his family is where he intends to be. She began to notice what he liked. Coffee strong, bread with butter but not jam. Silence in the mornings and conversation in the evenings, the other way around for most people. She accommodated these things without making a ceremony of noticing them, and he accommodated her in the same way. This woman who needed to be useful and competent and who bristled quietly when things were taken out of her hands without asking. He asked. He always asked now, "Can I help with this? Do you want a hand with that?" He asked and then waited for the answer and accepted it either way. Thomas and Bess had by this point established a friendship of such complete ease that separating them for any reason was met with the quiet but firm resistance of two small people who had found exactly the right counterpart. One evening, Ruth was putting Bess to bed, and Bess said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to approach difficult questions sideways, "Mama, are we going to leave when the snow goes?" Ruth smoothed the blanket. "That was the arrangement, love." Bess was quiet for a moment. "Thomas does not want us to go," she said. "He told me." Ruth said, "Thomas is very sweet." "I do not want to go either," Bess said. She said it simply, without drama, just as information she thought her mother should have. Then she turned onto her side and closed her eyes and went to sleep. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark. She went downstairs. Archer was at the table. He had a cup of coffee he was not drinking, and he was looking at it the way a man looks at something he is using as a placeholder while he thinks about something else. She sat down across from him. "Bess told me Thomas does not want us to leave," she said. He looked up. "In spring," she said, "when the roads open, as arranged." He was quiet. The fire popped and settled. "Thomas is not the only one," he said. She looked at him across the table. She looked at his face, this face she had been looking at for 3 months and had learned to read the way you learn to read difficult terrain, carefully and with respect for everything it did not show on the surface. "Archer," she said, "I need you to say it plainly. I have had enough of arrangements and agreements and things that seemed clear and turned out to mean different things to different people. If there is something you want to say it as it is." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put both hands flat on the table, the way a man settles himself before saying something that matters. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because I need a housekeeper. The housekeeper in town will be recovered by spring and I will manage otherwise. I am asking you to stay because this house has been quiet in a way that was wrong for 3 years, and it has not been wrong since November, and I know the reason for that, and the reason is sitting across this table looking at me." He paused. "I would like you to stay as more than a temporary arrangement. I would like you to stay permanently if that is something you could want. And I understand if it is not. You came here for a wage and a bridge to somewhere else, and I changed the terms, and that is not fair, and I know it." Ruth looked at him. She thought about a rule she had made on a cold morning in a town she had not wanted to stay in. No more hollow foundations. No more agreements that meant different things to different people. No more building a life on something only she believed was solid. She said, "What are you offering me exactly? Not the arrangement. You." He held her gaze. "Everything I have," he said, "which is not extravagant. This ranch and this life and a boy who already thinks you are the best thing that has happened to this house since his mother was in it, which is the highest compliment he knows how to give." He paused. "And me, which I am aware is a project. I am not easy, and I am not open, and I have not let anyone close enough to matter in 3 years because mattering is dangerous, and I am apparently out of the energy it takes to keep treating it that way." Ruth sat with everything he had said. She thought about just until spring. She thought about what spring had meant when she said it. An escape route, a horizon, a way of not having to want anything because wanting was dangerous when you had been wrong about things before. She thought about 3 months of mornings with the snow outside and coffee between them in the quiet. She thought about Thomas saying, "I just meant." She thought about Bess asleep upstairs, trusting completely that whoever was holding her would keep her safe. She thought about what it meant that this ranch, this specific small corner of Wyoming with its difficult winter and its 2 quiet man and its 2 children who had found each other, had been the first place in 2 years that felt like it was holding her rather than requiring her to hold everything herself. "I am not uncomplicated either," she said. "I have a daughter and a history and a particular difficulty with trusting people who seem reliable, because I was badly wrong about that once, and I have not entirely forgiven myself for it." "I know," he said. "And I would need it to be real," she said. "Not an arrangement with a different name. Real." "That is what I am asking for," he said. "Real." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Then yes." He breathed. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet exhale of a man who has been holding something and has been allowed to put it down. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the kitchen, with the fire and the dark Wyoming winter outside, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said in the plainest possible language, and there was nothing left to manage or arrange or be temporary about. Spring came in its own time, as springs do, slowly and then suddenly, and with the particular tenderness of a season that understands it is arriving after something hard. The roads opened. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, and then from the valleys, and the creek ran high and cold and loud with everything that had been held frozen all winter. Ruth stayed. She did not pack her trunk. She did not make arrangements for the next place. She put the winter's last preserves in the cellar, and she started seeds in the south window of the kitchen, and she let Bess talk her into getting a small gray cat that Thomas named something entirely unsuitable, and they kept anyway. She and Archer married on a Saturday in April, in the same plain, honest way he did everything, in the preacher's parlor in town with Thomas beside him, and Bess beside her, and Ruth in the blue dress that seemed to be the dress she wore when her life changed, which she was beginning to think of as a good omen. He put the ring on her hand with both of his, and looked at her with those river-colored eyes that she could read now, had learned over a winter of paying careful attention, and what was in them was not the careful management of a man keeping his distance. It was just him, all the way through. That evening, the 4 of them came home to the ranch as the sun was going down over the mountains, and Thomas ran ahead to feed the horses because he always ran ahead to feed the horses, and Bess chased after him because she always chased after him, and Archer stood with Ruth in the yard, and they watched the children go with the mountains behind them going gold and then pink, and then the deep, quiet purple of a Wyoming evening. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side. I have been thinking, she said. Tell me, he said. I never wanted temporary, she said. I think I told myself I did because wanting permanent felt too dangerous. But I never wanted temporary. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. I know, he said. I could see that. The first week. She looked up at him. You could not. You put the preserves up like someone who intended to eat them, he said. She laughed. He smiled. The real one. The one that had taken weeks to appear and that she now understood was the most honest thing on his face. Inside the house, the lamp burned in the window, and the cat was on the chair by the fire, and somewhere in the barn, Thomas was telling Bess something important about horses, and Bess was listening with the serious attention she gave to things that mattered. Ruth looked at all of it, the lamp and the mountain and the man beside her, and the sound of her daughter's voice carrying across the evening air. She had said just until spring. She had meant it as a boundary, a protection, a way of moving through one more temporary place without getting attached to something that was not going to last. But some places hold you before you have decided to be held. Some people become necessary before you have given them permission. Some springs arrive and the roads open, and you look around at what the winter built, and you understand that temporary was never really what you were looking for. You were looking for this. You were looking for real. If this story settled into you tonight, if something in Ruth or Archer or those two children finding each other felt like something you needed to hear, please tell me about it in the comments. Tell me which moment stayed. Tell me where you are watching from, whether you are somewhere warm and already home, or somewhere you are still making your way toward. I read every single word you leave for me, and I am always grateful for it. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that right now, because there are more stories here. Stories about temporary things that became permanent, about careful people who found someone worth being less careful for, about children who find each other, and about the homes that grow up around them. Come back soon. The lamp is always on here, and the story is always waiting, and it is always for you.